Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away, the systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. You remember that shot of Katniss walking through Victor's village in District 12? Perfect houses, empty streets, snow on the roofs, silence everywhere, and somehow it feels more haunted than the seam. If this place is a reward, why does it feel so wrong? Why does the so-called safest neighborhood in the district feel like the capital built a ghost town on purpose? At face value, the idea sounds simple. You win the Hunger Games, you get a mansion, hot water, a stocked pantry, a soft bed, and you never worry about Tesserae again. The capital builds a luxury cul-de-sac in every district as a thank you gift to the few kids who survive. But here's the real question. Why would a brutal dictatorship invest this much in pampering the people it just traumatized on live television? You think back to the early games when victors were basically dumped back home with some money and trauma, and that was it. No curated neighborhood, no identical houses lined up on a hill. So why the change? What's the reason for turning victory into real estate? Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you win. Victor's village is proof the capital doesn't stop playing. The core contradiction sits right there in the architecture. The capital needs every district terrified of the games, convinced that rebellion means their children in the arena, but it also needs them obsessed with winning, volunteering, training, hoping their name is the one that comes up with a chance to come back rich. Victor's village is where that contradiction gets poured into concrete. It's a promise and a threat, sharing the same front yard. Look at District 12's version. It's literally above the town, on a rise, with a clear view of the mines and the seam. Children can see those big white houses from below, but they can't touch them. That part matters because it turns the victor into a billboard. Every brick says, the capital can give you this, while every empty window whispers, the capital can take everyone else away. And notice the details the story keeps coming back to. The overstocked pantries when the rest of the district is starving. The full electricity when the seam barely has power. Haymitch's house rotting under piles of bottles. Katniss hiding in an empty unit when the fence is suddenly electrified. There is a lot to uncover here if you stop treating those details as background set dressing and start reading them as psychological design. Because this is where we talk about control, the placement of the village, the separation from the district, the comfort inside versus scarcity outside, the way victors are visible but isolated. That's not random. It's the blueprint for how the capital runs all of Panem. Economy as bait, fear as policy, media as spotlight, and just enough manufactured hope to keep everyone exactly where they are. By the end of this video, Victor's village is going to look less like a prize and more like the prettiest prison the capital ever built. Winning the games is not winning the game. So if Victor's village is the prettiest prison the capital ever built, we have to ask, when did prisons start looking this good? Back in the early Hunger Games, in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes era, there is nothing glamorous about it. The arena is basically a crumbling sports stadium. Tributes are dragged in on trucks, thrown into cages under the stands, barely fed, barely treated as human. The broadcasts are glitchy, ratings are low, and the capital is still figuring out why anyone would want to watch children die on purpose. Compare that to Katniss's time. Now you've got chariots, stylists, fire dresses, Caesar Flickerman, sponsorships. The whole thing runs like a deadly awards show. Same murder, new packaging. And here's the real question. Why does the system evolve from bare-bones brutality to polished, celebrity-driven spectacle? This is where we talk about Victor's Village. Because once the games become a show, the victor has to become a star. So why give victors money in a world built on scarcity? Why give them houses when most people in their district can't keep a roof over their heads? Why move them into a separate enclave instead of letting them stay in the seam, or the hob, or right above the bakery? At face value, it looks generous. You win, you never work again. Your family eats, you get hot water, full electricity, a fancy phone line straight to the capital. But that part matters because every one of those perks is also a leash. The money comes from the games. The house exists because of the games. The reason you're separated is so the games can keep using you. Winning the games is not the end of the game. It's the start of a lifelong contract. You mentor new tributes every year. You go on victory tours, smiling in the districts where children you killed used to live. You shoot propaganda. You sit on couches in Caesar's studio. You perform your assigned talent so your trauma can be repackaged as entertainment. And all of that happens under constant surveillance, disguised as luxury. So why build the village as a physical place, not just a paycheck? Because geography is propaganda. In District 12, Victor's Village sits on a hill, a little suburb you can see but not touch. Kids walking to the mines pass those houses and get a daily reminder the games are horrible, but they are also your only visible escape. And that's the bigger in-universe stake. It's not just one traumatized teenager in a nice house. It's the way the capital rearranges every district's landscape so the games live in your peripheral vision all year. You don't just remember the reaping. You remember the roof you don't have. And the roof the victor does. There is a lot to uncover here, because this isn't just Panem. Authoritarian systems everywhere survive by making oppression look like opportunity. If you don't understand that relationship, you miss why people cling to a rigged promise of hope, and why breaking that promise later is so explosive. So how does the capital keep that illusion stable once victors start cracking under the pressure? That's where we're going to cover the fine print of this contract. Mentoring, media, and the moment the quarter quell blows it all apart. Our lens on Panem. What this video is actually arguing, so when we talk about mentoring, media and that quarter quell twist, we're not just recapping plot. We're laying out a claim. Victor's Village isn't a cute world-building detail. It's the capital's cleanest case study of how they weaponize wealth, fear, media, and hope in one polished package. At face value, it looks simple. You win the games, you get a mansion, steady food, hot water, and a permanent escape from the reaping. Your district gets celebrations, maybe extra grain, maybe a brief sense that the capital can be generous. But here's the real question. If this is such a generous reward, why does every long-term victor we meet seem broken, watched, or both? This is where we talk about promise versus reality. On paper, victors get safety, status, and comfort. In practice, they lose autonomy. Their phone lines go straight to the capital. Their time is carved up by mandatory mentoring, victory tours, and those staged interviews where Caesar Flickerman turns genuine trauma into digestible TV. The relationship flips, the games end, but the contract doesn't. You don't belong to your district anymore. You belong to the narrative. So in this video, we're going to cover Victor's Village as a kind of curated cage. The space is open, the doors aren't locked, but every path out runs through capital approval. You're exempt from the mines, but not from Snow's orders. You have money, but you spend it under surveillance. That part matters because it shows how the capital can use comfort to deepen control instead of loosening it. Then we're going to zoom out. What happens in Victor's village is just the most visible version of what's happening everywhere. The capital redraws districts so no region can feed itself, then controls the trains and food supply lines so everyone stays dependent. Peacekeepers patrol the squares, stage public whippings, and enforce the Treaty of Treason so fear becomes background noise. The broadcasts frame each district as a stereotype, then replay those roles until people start believing them. Pattern interrupt here. The Hunger Games might not be the capital's most dangerous weapon. The real weapon is the story wrapped around them, the interviews, the edited footage, the way a smiling Victor on a balcony convinces a starving kid that the system sometimes pays off. We'll trace that all the way from Snow's early career managing poison and optics, to how Caesar sells every tribute as a character, to why only Victor's village survives when District 12 is bombed. And we're pulling from both the books and the films to do it. The spacing of the houses, Haymitch's decayed home, Peter's prosthetic leg, Katniss hiding in an empty villa. When the movies cut or soften those details, it actually sharpens what the story wants to say about power. By the end, Victor's village stops reading as a reward. It becomes a blueprint for how the capital runs Panem. Control the food, control the fear, control the camera, and then sell it all back as hope. You're mapped to Panem's control system, so if Victor's village is the blueprint, what does the rest of the machine look like? You're not just touring one creepy cul-de-sac, you're about to walk through the whole operating system the capital uses to keep Panem running, on fear, and just enough hope to stop it from exploding. Here's how we're going to cover it. First, we go back, all the way to the dark days, and those early clunky games that barely functioned as television, let alone as policy. Back then, the punishment was raw, arenas that were basically open fields, tributes dumped in with rusty weapons, victors sent home with trauma and maybe a medal. No mansion, no permanent food supply for the district. So why the change? Why invest in custom-built victors' villages and a fully produced show? This is where we talk about Snow and his team realizing they didn't just need fear, they needed a story people would keep watching. Once we've built that origin story, we'll move into the mechanics. How do you take something as horrifying as the games and make volunteering sound rational, even desirable in certain districts? At face value, it looks simple. Win and your family eats. But there is a lot to uncover here. We'll break down the capital's monopoly on resources, the way each district is trapped into one industry, and how controlled scarcity makes a shiny house on a hill feel worth dying for. Then we fold in fear, peacekeepers, public whippings, the Treaty of Treason, the annual reminder that rebellion means your children bleed on screen. Over all of that, the capital layers media, Caesar Flickerman, edited broadcasts, sponsorships, until the games feel less like punishment and more like a twisted career path. To keep it grounded, we're going to cover 3 case studies. District 12 as the control group, where volunteering almost never happens, and Victor's village sits mostly empty, turning into a haunted suburb more than a prize. Then the career districts, the capital's dream outcome, where children train from birth because the relationship between risk and reward has been completely flipped. And in between, we'll speculate on those mid-tier districts we never really see. Places with 1 or 2 victors, half-filled villages, and kids who grow up staring at those houses wondering if the promise is real or rigged. After that, we'll zoom out into a meta segment, book versus movie. Why the novels linger on Katniss's training period in the village, on Peter's prosthetic leg, on empty houses and full pantries, while the films streamline the neighborhood into a quick establishing shot. What do those adaptation choices say about how we, the audience, consume spectacle? Here's the real question. When the camera cuts away from a victor's trauma, whose comfort is being protected, the characters, or ours, and then will end on a speculative, slightly unhinged closer, imagining how each district's victor's village might actually look and function if you walked through it today. The coal-dusted mansions of 12, a glittering tech suburb in 3, a waterfront compound in 4 that feels almost resort level until you remember the blood price. That part matters because it brings us back to the core tension of Panem's design. Is this world really held together by terror or by carefully rationed hope handed out in the shape of a house, a full pantry, a televised promise that you could be next? By the time we're done, you'll have a map of that whole system, and you'll see Victor's Village as the legend in the corner, quietly explaining everything. If you're new to Victor's Village, so if you're listening to all of this and thinking, wait, we're treating a fictional housing development as a diagnostic tool for authoritarian governance, yes, welcome to Victor's Village. If you're new here, this is where we talk about Panem as if a political science department got trapped inside a fandom brain. We're going to cover the Hunger Games the way the Capitol would hate. Slow, forensic, and way too aware of how the system actually works. At face value, it's just YA dystopia. But here's the real question. What happens when you stop treating it as metaphor and start treating it as a real state trying to survive? On this channel, we zoom in on details the narrative drops and then walk them out to their logical conclusion. The Treaty of Treason isn't just backstory, it's a founding document that legally hardwires fear into Panem's DNA. District 13 isn't just the rebels underground. It's a competing government with its own propaganda machine and its own relationship to control. That part matters because once you see both the capital and 13 as states, you can compare their tactics instead of just picking a side. So if this is your first time here and the idea of overanalyzing fictional dictatorships sounds fun, you're in the right place. You're the person who hears peacekeepers and immediately wonders about recruitment pipelines and pay scales. You hear Caesar Flickerman laughing on screen and think, who's writing his talking points? Who's approving the edit? There is a lot to uncover here, and we treat every games arena, every victor's interview, every district riot as data. We've already dug into things like how the Treaty of Treason quietly justifies permanent collective punishment, why District 13's governance swaps one form of scarcity control for another, and how the arena is basically a televised lab for testing public thresholds for violence. Future videos go further off the map, speculative world building that asks how food distribution actually works, how black markets in places like the Hob undermine the capital's monopoly, and what a post-snow constitution would even need to look like to break the cycle. If you want to follow that whole project, you can subscribe or just mentally move into Victor's Village with us so you don't miss the next breakdown, especially the episodes where we push beyond what the books show and start reverse engineering the bureaucracy sitting behind every random reaping and every suspiciously convenient power outage. Because this video isn't a one-off. It's one tile in a larger mosaic where we map how the capital controls Panem through economy, fear, media, and manufactured hope. Victor's Village is our case study today, but it plugs into everything. The treaty, the broadcasts, the district's enforced dependence. Next, we're going to pull back out and place this shiny little suburb inside the wider machine so you can see exactly which gears it's turning and why the capital was willing to build mansions just to keep the games running. From dark days to designer death shows. How the games evolved so to see why the capital is handing out mansions to child killers. We have to rewind. Back past Katniss, past Haymitch, all the way to the dark days and the moment Panem decides terror is going to be its national language. The Treaty of Treason doesn't just end the war. It writes the Hunger Games into the country's operating system. One reaping, 24 children. Annual reminder. On paper, that sounds brutally efficient. But here's the real question. How do you actually make a whole nation watch that every year without the system tearing itself apart? Back then, the early games are a mess. We're going to cover the polished arena you know later. But the first versions? They're held in a bombed-out sports stadium. Tributes are hauled in on trains, dumped in cages in the zoo, starved, sick, barely washed. There's no parade, no stylists, no chariots, just a handful of capital citizens wandering by to gawk at caged, terrified children. At face value, it's punishment. As television, it's unwatchable. Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes shows this really clearly. The broadcasts are grainy, the commentary is dull, the audience is bored or actively disgusted. Some capital families skip watching altogether. Others question whether it's too much, which is hilarious in a regime that just bombed a district out of existence. But that part matters, because it exposes the capital's core problem. Terror works once. Tradition has to work forever. So the capital is stuck balancing a brutal equation. The games must be horrifying enough that no district even thinks about another rebellion. But they also have to be palatable enough that capital citizens treat them as an event, not a war crime. If the capital turns away in moral revolt, the spectacle collapses. If the districts turn away in numb despair, the deterrent weakens. The whole relationship between fear and entertainment has to be recalibrated. This is where we talk about Coriolanus Snow, long before the roses and the presidency, standing in a classroom trying to win a scholarship. He's assigned as a mentor in what is basically a failing TV pilot, and he realizes something the older capital officials don't. Terror alone is cheap. People tune in for story, for favorites, for the promise, however twisted, that someone might win. So Snow starts pushing narrative, backstories for tributes, gifts from sponsors, interviews that turn children into characters instead of anonymous bodies in an arena. He experiments with incentives, food rewards for districts, prizes for mentors, attention for anyone who plays along. There is a lot to uncover here, but the key shift is this. The games stop being only a sentence. They start pretending to be an opportunity. From there, Victor's village is inevitable. If you want districts to keep sending children without open revolt, you can't sell the games as a one-way trip to the slaughterhouse forever. You need one shining exception. One house on a hill that says, if you win, everything changes. Snow's long-term solution is to build that promise into the landscape itself. So when you see those empty mansions waiting in every district, the question isn't just who will live there, it's what the capital plans to make you do and hope for to get the keys. Snow's big idea, making murder look like a scholarship Snow, is the reason that House on the Hill exists at all. Back in the 10th Hunger Games, the arena is basically a bombed-out zoo, and the tributes are treated as disposable livestock. They're penned in cages, barely fed, and the broadcasts are boring. Ratings are low. Districts aren't engaged. Even the capital is starting to tune out. So here's the real question. How do you turn a punishment no one wants to watch into a national event no one is allowed to ignore? This is where we talk about Snow as a media strategist before he's a president. In the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, you watch him realize that the tributes can't just be nameless victims. They have to be characters, people you can bet on, root for, project yourself onto. That part matters because once you see a tribute as a character, you're already halfway to accepting the games as a story instead of a massacre. So he experiments. Food parcels tied to betting, rewards for mentors who can get their tribute sponsors, tiny incentives that turn apathy into participation. You're not just forced to watch anymore, you're invited to play along. The relationship between capital viewer and dying child shifts from horror to investment, and snow clocks how powerful that is. But there is a lot to uncover here, because those early bribes expose a structural problem. If the only outcome you ever see is death, how long before the illusion cracks and every district decides the games are unwinnable? Why cheer for a slaughter where the house always wins? Why send your children mentally, emotionally, if there's no believable way out? Snow's answer is disturbingly elegant. You don't just reward survival with life, you reward it with ascension. The promise becomes, survive the arena and you don't go back to the seam or the slag heap. You move uphill, literally and socially. At face value, Victor's Village is a scholarship made of stone and electricity. A fully powered house, full cupboards, safety from the reaping, your family lifted out of the worst of the district's misery. We're going to cover how this plays out, but notice the functional need first. The games require a visible, reliable prize, or the whole system collapses into obvious rigging and despair. Victor's Village is Snow institutionalizing a guarantee. Every district child can point to a roof tile and say, if I win, that's mine. Every parent can rationalize sending their kid to the reaping because there's at least a theoretical path to abundance. And it works on multiple levels. It keeps career districts feeding the arena with volunteers. It keeps poorer districts hoping for a miracle rather than organizing for revolt. It even turns victors into permanent advertisements, forced to mentor and appear on camera as living proof the promise is real. Once you understand Victor's Village as political technology to sell the games, you start to notice the same logic everywhere. In how each district's economy is starved just enough, in how the media diet mixes terror with just a little hope. So the next question is, how do food, fear, and television all sync up to keep Panem exactly where Snow wants it? Building the village. Why the capital puts luxury on display, so if Victor's Village is selling the games, we have to zoom in on the set itself. What does the capital actually build when it builds a village? Physically, it's a tiny suburb dropped into each district, a neat ring or cluster of big detached houses, identical in style, with paved streets and working streetlights when the rest of the district goes dark. There's running water, reliable electricity, manicured lawns that somehow stay green in a coal town, and peacekeeper patrols that feel less like protection and more like a velvet fence. In District 12, that contrast hits you in the face. You've got the seam, soot-stained shacks, sagging roofs, coal dust in every crack. Then you walk up the hill, and suddenly it's pristine white houses, glass windows, stocked kitchens, hot water on demand. At face value, it's a reward. You win the games, you get out of the mud. But here's the real question. If the capital can build this level of comfort here, why doesn't it fix anything for everyone else? That part matters because the village has to be inside the district, not in the capital. For the illusion to work, they could easily relocate every victor to some luxury high-rise in the city and keep them under direct control. Instead, they leave them on display at home. You're meant to see your local victor at the market, passing by in clean clothes, never worrying about tesserae again. They become walking billboards that say, "See? The system is fair. You suffer, but there's a chance." And yet, the village is always set apart. Elevated on a hill in 12, tucked behind gates or tree lines in the wealthier districts. Even where the average standard of living is higher, the Victor houses still look curated, capital approved, a slightly different architectural accent that reminds everyone who paid for it. You can see it. You can't touch it. That distance creates a very specific relationship. Children grow up both dreaming of getting in and resenting the people who already live there. This is where we talk about social fracture. The capital doesn't just want hope, it wants divided hope. Victors are technically from the district, but now they're not really of it. Neighbors who once shared hunger now watch those same people eat well behind better locks. Victors feel watched by the capital and watched by their own people, outsiders in the only home they're allowed to have. And this isn't unique to Panem. Authoritarian regimes build model neighborhoods, showcase factories, model farms that get all the fertilizer and cameras. Potemkin villages to prove the promise is real while the majority starves off screen. Victor's village is Panem's version of that, a permanent set piece proving the game's work, carefully maintained even when the rest of the district is literally bombed to ash. So once you see the village as architecture plus propaganda, the next question is, how do food, fear, and television plug into that same design and keep everyone staring at the mansion instead of the fence? The psychology of the prize, how Victor's village rewires risk. So once you're staring at that mansion instead of the fence, the next shift is even darker. Because Victor's village doesn't just decorate the games, it rewires the risk. At face value, it's simple. Survive the arena, get a house, get food, get out of the reaping forever. But here's the real question. Why does Snow want the districts to see that trade-off so clearly, year after year, generation after generation? Snow's goal isn't mercy, it's recruitment. He wants a better class of tributes. Stronger bodies from the lumber camps of 7, the fisheries of 4, the training halls of 1 and 2. Kids who are charismatic enough to sell a sponsor narrative and brutal enough to deliver good television. The capital doesn't just want death. It wants ratings, story arcs, a victor it can parade as proof that the system works. That part matters because once you believe there's a system, you start asking how to game it instead of how to burn it down. Now put yourself in a starving district. Your name's in the bowl 10-15 times from Tesserae. You're already gambling your life for grain. Suddenly the games aren't just a random death lottery. They're a twisted opportunity. If the fence keeps you poor and hungry, Victor's village whispers a different promise. If you're going to die anyway, why not die with a chance at a mansion? The risk-reward calculation tilts, not because the arena is safer, but because your everyday life is already so lethal. And the village is always there, a long-term advertisement you can't turn off. Every morning, kids in District 12 walk past those perfect houses on the hill, full electricity when the seam goes dark, stocked pantries when the black market is empty. Hamitch's decaying porch is still more square footage than most families will ever see. There is a lot to uncover here. You grow up with a constant visual reminder that someone from here did win. Not some mythic hero from another district. Your neighbor, your coal miner's son, your baker's boy. This is where we talk about mentoring. Once a district has a victor, that person is forced into the role of coach. They explain sponsor strategy, train you in private, tell you which careers to avoid in the bloodbath. Over time, the whole district builds a mini talent pipeline around that knowledge. Training for the games stops being unthinkable and starts being a responsible preparation, the way parents in 2 push their kids toward the academies. The relationship between district and arena shifts from pure terror to grim professionalism, and that's exactly where fear and hope intersect. Snow never turns down the terror dial. Peacekeepers, public whippings, the Treaty of Treason, the arena itself, all of that stays. He just layers one glittering "but what if" on top. What if you're the exception? What if your family never starves again? What if your district gets extra food and celebrations because you brought them a win? So the real weapon isn't the village's comfort. It's the calculus it forces you to make. And when you apply that same calculus to food, to media, to every promise the capital dangles in front of Panem, the pattern gets even more dangerous than Victor's village alone. Volunteering on purpose when the trap starts to work. So here's the twist. In a pure terror system, volunteering should almost never happen. If your only goal is fear, you don't want kids raising their hands. You want the reaping to be this frozen moment where everyone is praying not to hear their name, where the horror is that there is no escape, no choice, no heroic gesture that can pull someone out. That's what a straightforward punishment ritual would look at face value. 2 names, no substitutions, no negotiations. So why does the capital allow volunteers at all? Why create a world where, in some places, stepping forward actually makes sense? This is where we talk about design. Snow doesn't just want obedience, he wants participation. He wants some families to look at the stage and think, if it has to be someone, maybe it should be us. The only way that works is if the payoff is absurd compared to the baseline. Your normal district life is 12 people to a room, coal dust in your lungs, or fishing until your hands bleed. Winning the games earns you a mansion in Victor's village, endless food, hot water, safety from the reaping for your entire family. Suddenly, volunteering isn't just a death sentence. It's a lottery ticket with a house attached. And in districts 1, 2, and 4, that calculus becomes a culture. Parents train their kids with swords and tridents. Children grow up seeing the village not as a myth, but as a neighborhood they can literally point to. The relationship between the shabby workers' housing and the perfect lawns of the village is the sales pitch. This isn't just a fantasy, this is real estate. Careers aren't rebelling against the system, they're buying in. There is a lot to uncover here. When families groom a child for the arena, they're telling themselves a story. Our kid is strong, our district wins, the capital rewards us. Victor's village is the physical proof of that promise. That part matters because it turns the games from pure terror into a warped meritocracy. If you train hard enough, if you're from the right district, you can win. You deserved it. From the capital's perspective, volunteers are a propaganda goldmine. When a tribute from District 2 shouts, "I volunteer!" it reframes the entire event. It stops looking like state-mandated child murder and starts looking like a reality competition where some people are so confident they're eager to play. The cameras don't just capture fear, they capture ambition, pride, and the illusion of choice. And here's the real question. What does it tell us that Snow is willing to let some kids step forward and actually win big? It tells us the capital isn't chasing maximum fear, it's chasing the perfect blend of fear and hope. Just enough terror that most districts stay broken. Just enough visible success that a few districts keep sending their children willingly. So when you see a volunteer on that stage, you're not just watching courage, you're watching the trap working exactly as designed. District 12, the village no one believes in, so if a volunteer in District 2 is the trap working perfectly, District 12 is what it looks like when the trap misfires. You walk up the hill to Victor's village in 12, and it's quiet. Too quiet. At face value, it has all the same ingredients as the other districts. 12 identical houses, manicured streets, that little capital promise of safety wrapped in fresh paint and working electricity. But here's the real question. What happens when almost nobody ever lives there? Before Katniss and Peter, District 12 has only 2 living victors. Haymitch, and in the books, an older unnamed woman who dies before the story starts. That means most of those houses stand empty for decades. No kids playing in the yards, no parties, no constant reminder that someone from here made it. Just this weird echoing suburb on a hill that everyone can see and almost no one enters. That part matters because the whole point of Victor's village is visibility. You're supposed to grow up staring at those windows and thinking, if I win the games, I get that. In 12, the opposite happens. The emptiness becomes the message. The village doesn't say, look how many victors we have. It quietly whispers, almost everyone dies. So the culture responds. District 12 doesn't build a tradition of volunteering. There's no career academy, no parents training their children to game the system. The reaping isn't a stage for ambition. It's a yearly panic attack. You see it in Katniss's horror when she realizes she's about to volunteer for Prim. Volunteering isn't heroic there, it's unthinkable. The relationship between 12 and the games is pure fear, no glamour. There is a lot to uncover here, because when the capital drops a miniature suburb into a starving coal district, it doesn't feel aspirational, it feels intrusive. The village is physically separate, fenced off, elevated. It reads less as a dream destination and more as a foreign object the capital planted in their backyard, a reminder of control instead of a promise of hope. This is where we talk about Katniss actually moving into that space. On paper, she's made it. Hot water, full pantry, closets of clothing. But her first instinct is to sleep with her hunting jacket, to stash weapons, to keep one foot mentally in the seam. The luxury doesn't translate into freedom. It just changes the texture of her anxiety. She's isolated from Gale, from her old routines, from the only environment where she ever had real agency. And she knows the deal hasn't changed. Peacekeepers still patrol. The phone to the capital still works one way. Her family is safer from the reaping, but more exposed to political pressure. The house is bigger, the cage is nicer, the games are still happening. They've just moved into her living room in the form of mentoring, cameras, and Snow's threats. So why does this matter for the larger system? Because District 12 exposes that the capital's design isn't perfectly efficient. Some districts never buy the sales pitch. When the incentive structure fails, all that's left is naked coercion, and that's brittle. Weak spots form exactly where the promise doesn't land. In 12, the empty village becomes a daily reminder that the capital can be beaten, that its stories don't always stick. And once you have a place where the story is already fraying, you have the perfect soil for rebellion. Which is why in the next part, we need to see what happens when the capital tries to fix that problem with even more control, and accidentally turns its ghost town into ground zero for a revolution. Katniss the wrong kind of volunteer, so when you already have a ghost town turning into quiet resistance, what happens if the capital accidentally moves in the one person who refuses to play along from day one? This is where we talk about Katniss as the wrong kind of volunteer. Go back to that reaping. At face value, it's routine. Names, tension, maybe a career tribute stepping forward for glory. The system expects volunteers to be ambitious, hungry for status, the kind of person who sees the games as a brutal but acceptable ladder. But Katniss doesn't step up for wealth or fame or even better odds. She moves because her 12-year-old sister screams. She volunteers for Prim out of pure protective love. No calculation, no promise of a better life in some distant victor's village. And here's the real question. What do you do as Snow when the most watched volunteer in years is visibly horrified by the entire premise? The capital script says a volunteer should confirm the games are worth aspiring to. Katniss's body language on stage says the exact opposite. That part matters because volunteering is supposed to advertise the relationship between risk and reward. You suffer now, your district celebrates later. You retire in luxury. Career districts have been trained to believe this bargain. Katniss exposes the real reason most people would ever volunteer. Desperation, not devotion. Her choice is a parental instinct in a teenager's body, and that makes her dangerous. She doesn't buy into the system. She's trying to shield someone from it. Fast forward to Victor's village. The capital expects the standard arc, traumatized Victor, then mentor, then minor celebrity. You host dinners, give advice on camera, maybe develop a charming talent. Instead, Katniss becomes a recluse who keeps sneaking under the electrified fence to hunt. The mansion is powered, stocked, and surveilled, but she keeps going back to the woods, to the bow, to the life the capital was supposed to have replaced. So why is that such a problem? Because Victor's village is meant to prove the system works. If your star Victor is visibly miserable, flinching at cameras, refusing to transform into a capital darling, the whole promise of hope starts to look fake. The audience in the districts can tell when a story doesn't fit. Snow sees this misalignment immediately. That's why he shows up in her living room, why he weaponizes the media tour, why every interview with Peter becomes a loyalty test. We're going to cover how those broadcasts are edited, but the key is this. He's trying to shove Katniss back into the role of compliant Victor, the girl who smiles on cue and sells the romance as proof the games produce happy endings. And when she won't, her house in the village shifts from asset to liability, a crack in the facade other Victors and districts can stare at every day. The real question is, what happens when more than one house in Victor's village starts failing its script? The districts we never see. Filling in the blanks so if one broken Victor in District 12 can warp the script, what happens in the districts we barely see at all? The ones that aren't desperate coal miners or polished career factories, but something in between, because our whole relationship to Panem is biased. You live in Katniss's head, you visit the capital's favorites, and the camera barely glances at districts 5, 6, 9, or 10. At face value, that makes it easy to assume there are only two models: terrified non-volunteers and proud career academies. But here's the real question. What does normal even look like in a system built on abnormal violence? This is where we talk about the mid-tier districts. District 5, power. District 6, transportation. District 9, grain. District 10, livestock. Their tributes aren't total amateurs, but they're not trained celebrities either. Think about the District 5 girl in Catching Fire, smart enough to blow the arena force field. Or the morphling Victors from 6, so damaged they self-medicate into oblivion. Or the way 9 and 10 tributes usually die early, with almost no sponsorship, barely mentioned by Caesar. There is a lot to uncover here. What do those details tell you? These are places where the games matter, but they're not the entire local identity. People know the names of a few Victors. They gossip about capital parties, but the reaping still feels random, not a career path. You don't see mass volunteering on screen from 5, 6, 9, or 10 for a reason. The promise of Victor's village exists, yet it's distant enough that most kids treat it as a grim lottery, not a goal. So picture their villages, not the ghost suburb in 12 where every empty house is a reminder of failure, and not the packed compounds of District 1 or 2. In 5 or 9, it's probably a small gated street on the edge of the processing plants or the fields. Always powered. Always stocked. You walk past the fence on the way to work and point it out to your kids. That's where a Victor lives. Real enough to touch the wall. Unreal enough that you never expect to open the gate. That part matters because it changes how hope works. In a place without a history of winning, Victor's village becomes semi-mythical infrastructure, a story parents use to explain the reaping. Someone has to go, maybe they'll win, maybe we'll all eat better for a year. The capital designs one system, but it lands as ghost housing, fairy tale suburb, or career campus depending on which district you stand in. Now imagine one outlier, a charismatic Victor from 5 who comes home, mentors aggressively, and quietly encourages smarter, more strategic tributes. Suddenly, volunteering creeps in at the edges, framed as giving your siblings a chance to stay safe. Or flip it, a beloved Victor in 10, who returns maimed, refuses to smile for the cameras, and spends every tour visit hinting that the games are rigged. In a mid-tier district, a single person can tilt the culture toward ambition or quiet resistance. And for the capital, that's the risk baked into their own design. The same village blueprint that breeds obedient career pipelines in some places creates unstable, hard-to-read pockets of influence in others. So how do you keep that from turning into open defiance? To answer that, we have to zoom out from the houses and look at the bigger tools: food, fear, and the peacekeepers at the gate. Career districts, when oppression feels like tradition food; fear, peacekeepers at the gate. That's the blunt force side of control. But in some places, the capital doesn't just threaten you into obedience. It convinces you to train for it. This is where we talk about the career districts: 1, 2, and 4. On paper, they're just specialized regions in Panem's economic machine. Luxury goods in 1, masonry and peacekeeper pipelines in 2, fishing in 4. At face value, that just sounds efficient. You make jewelry, you carve stone, you haul in seafood. But here's the real question. Why do those particular jobs come with a slightly higher standard of living and a completely different relationship to the games? Compared to somewhere like 12, where you're literally dying in the mines, these districts have just enough comfort to feel above the others. District 1 decorates the capital's parties. District 2 builds the infrastructure and trains the enforcers. District 4 feeds the capital's tables with prized fish. That part matters because status is a resource too. The capital doesn't just pay them in money, it pays them in hierarchy. And that hierarchy bleeds straight into childhood. In career districts, training for the games is normalized the way going to school is for you. Kids grow up in informal training centers, gyms that are technically illegal, but everyone knows they exist. Peacekeepers walk past racks of weapons and obstacle courses and somehow don't see anything. Why? Because those kids are future entertainment. For them, the arena isn't a horror story, it's a rite of passage. You're not unlucky if your name is drawn, you're almost embarrassed if you never get the chance to volunteer. The cultural script says, you train, you volunteer, you win, you move into Victor's village. It's the ultimate status symbol, the mansion at the end of a very bloody rainbow. So why does the capital tolerate all this rule bending? We're going to cover the media angle later, but the short answer is ratings and myth. Career tributes are highly skilled, photogenic, and trained to perform. They make for better television, which means better propaganda. When a career from 1 or 2 dominates the arena, it sells the idea that the games are merit-based. If you're strong enough, dedicated enough, sponsored enough, anyone can win, right? Except, no. The odds are still rigged. Sponsorships favor familiar, glamorous districts. Training is technically banned, but selectively ignored. It's meritocracy theater, and the careers are the lead actors. Here's the twist that stings. The districts most invested in the games are the ones most colonized by capital ideology. They celebrate the reaping. They throw feasts when a victor returns. Victor's village in 1, 2, and 4 isn't a haunted edge-of-town suburb, it's prime real estate, proof that the system works. Until catching fire. When victors are thrown back into the arena, careers like Finnick and Brutus suddenly realize the promise was never real. Their loyalty didn't protect them. And once the most devoted believers start to question the games, the entire structure of hope the capital built on those villages begins to crack. So if the careers are the willing pillars of the system, what happens when those pillars start to fall? And the cameras are still rolling, labeling the killers. How career tribute becomes a brand. Careers don't just fall. They get rebranded on the way down. You never hear the capital call them child soldiers. You hear career tributes. 2 soft words. Smooth, at face value, it sounds professional, even admirable, as if they've chosen a respectable path in life. Not kids conditioned to kill so the capital can have better television. A career tribute is a product name. This is where we talk about that label as marketing. Career taps into ambition. It suggests training, expertise, a path you can work toward. Tribute keeps the games wrapped in the language of duty and sacrifice. Put them together, and you get something that sounds closer to Olympian than exploited teenager. There is a lot to uncover here, because once you rename violence as a career, you've already done half the propaganda work. Watch how Caesar Flickerman and Claudius Templesmith handle them on camera. They don't say, "Here come the most heavily indoctrinated children in Panem." They talk about the pride of District 1, the legendary training programs of 2, the favorites to win. They admire strategy, physique, confidence. They praise Cato's aggression as if he's playing the game correctly, not revealing how thoroughly the system has hollowed him out. And you, sitting in the audience, are nudged to agree. Here's the real question. Why does the capital need you to see them as professionals? Because then the games start to resemble a sport. Once you frame the arena as a professional field, Victor's Village becomes a trophy instead of a crime scene. A mansion isn't blood money, it's a signing bonus. The relationship between murder and reward gets blurred under the glow of "they earned it." That part matters because it justifies the entire infrastructure around victors. If a career tribute is basically an athlete, then of course they deserve a special neighborhood, endorsements, and lifelong perks. The promise of that career is what makes parents in District 1 or 2 quietly tolerate sending their kids into training halls. It feels less like feeding your child to the games and more like investing in their future. And over time, the districts themselves start using the label with pride. You can imagine a mother bragging, "My son's in the career track," as if she's talking about a prestigious academy. Kids grow up saying they want to be a career tribute without ever questioning why that word exists in the first place. The capital doesn't have to force the narrative, it just supplies the vocabulary and lets people repeat it. So here's the question that loops back on us. What are the terms in Panem and in our world turn exploitation into aspiration? Peacekeeper for armed enforcers, treaty of treason for a permanent threat, security measure for surveillance. When does collateral damage, essential worker, or defense industry start to sound suspiciously close to career tribute? And if the name sounds noble enough, how many of us stop asking what's actually happening behind it? Because if a label can make child killing sound normal, what else can it make you accept without a fight? Why allow volunteers at all? The dictator's dilemma. If a label can make child killing sound normal, here's the real question. Why does the capital ever let you choose it? You'd think a regime built on terror would keep the reaping as cold and mechanical as possible. 2 names. No substitutions, no bargaining. No chance for a sister to step forward and scream, "I volunteer," at the top of her lungs. At face value, volunteering looks almost humane. The capital is saying, if you really want to go in their place, we'll allow it. But why allow that escape hatch at all? Why give districts any sense of choice around the games, however tiny? Why risk a Katniss Everdeen moment that turns into a symbol? If the whole point is punishment and deterrence, wouldn't the purest form of control be a lottery you cannot negotiate with? So imagine a different Panem for a second. In this version, the Treaty of Treason still exists. The arena still runs every year. But the reaping is absolute. No volunteers, no career tributes, no district rewards, no grain, no oil, no celebrations, no victor's village at the edge of town promising warm water, and full cupboards, just a yearly ritual where the capital reaches into your district and takes whoever it wants. You can't train your children to improve their odds. You can't send your best to represent you. You can't even pretend there's a strategy. There is only fear and the understanding that nothing you do will ever matter. On paper, that sounds even more terrifying. So why doesn't Snow choose that model? This is where we talk about the dictator's dilemma. Snow doesn't just rule with whips and hovercrafts. He understands something crucial about human psychology. Terror by itself doesn't keep a system stable forever. It grinds people down into despair. And despair has a dangerous side effect. Once people believe they have nothing left to lose, they stop being predictable. There is a lot to uncover here in the relationship between fear and hope, allowing volunteers, building victors' villages, sending extra food to a winning district. All of that part matters because it injects a sliver of perceived agency into the horror. You can tell yourself, if we train harder, if we send our strongest, if I take extra tesserae now but my name doesn't get drawn, maybe we'll win someday. Is that agency real? Not really. The capital still rigs arenas, edits broadcasts and decides which tributes get sponsors. But the illusion is powerful. It diffuses anger. It turns some parents into coaches instead of rebels. It turns some children into career tributes instead of potential revolutionaries. So why even allow volunteers? Because the moment you can choose to step forward, you can also choose to believe the system might work for you, and that tiny poisonous hope is worth more to Snow than any amount of raw fear. We're going to cover exactly how he weaponizes that balance next, in the conversation where he spells it out. Fear, hope, and how much of each you're allowed to have. Hope, but make it weaponized. Snow's favorite equation. Snow actually tells you the whole strategy out loud. Rooftop garden, perfect roses. Seneca Crane thinking he's reinventing television. And Snow just cuts through it. Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. Then the knife twist. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. A spark is fine, as long as it's contained. At face value, it sounds almost philosophical. But here's the real question. Contained where? This is where we talk about Victor's village as the physical answer to that conversation. Snow isn't speaking in abstractions. He's designing real neighborhoods. You don't just tell the districts, winning is possible. You build 12 miniature proof of concepts and drop them on the edge of every district. You make sure every child walking home from the mines or the fields has to pass those big empty houses and think, someone from here did it. Someone escaped. There is a lot to uncover here, because the village is hope with a property line. It proves the games can be beaten, but only under the capital's rules, on capital cameras, in capital time. One boy, one girl, one victor, one mansion. That part matters because it turns hope into a competition, not a collective project. You aren't dreaming of your district rising up. You're dreaming of your own door in that silent cul-de-sac. Now contrast that with pure terror. Public whippings in the square. Peacekeepers shooting someone over a stray turkey. Entire districts bombed into ash. Those tools are in the toolbox too, but they have a downside. Mass suffering can create mass solidarity. If everyone in District 11 or 12 is equally doomed, the only rational move is to stop playing the game entirely. Fear alone pushes people toward each other. Hope, when it's scarce, does the opposite. The games in the village together create this twisted emotional equation. You dread the reaping with your whole body, but you also catch yourself narrating your own victory parade in your head. You hate the capital for taking your children, but you also catch your breath when you see Katniss's new house with full electricity and hot water. Do you rage at the system, or do you start calculating your odds? Pattern interrupt for a second. What if there were no prizes at all? No Victor's Village, no food for the district, no tours, no sponsors, nothing. Just a yearly slaughter. The horror would be clearer. The choice to resist would be simpler. The reason Snow invests in luxury suburbs is because confusion is more stable than clarity. And that's the capital's real genius. They don't just make you too afraid to rebel, they make you busy. Busy imagining yourself as the exception. Busy training, volunteering, trading tesserae, chasing individual survival and status, instead of asking why the system exists at all. We're going to cover how that illusion cracks, especially after the quarter quell, when the promise of win and you're safe finally collapses. Economy is cage. How the capital starves and spoils on purpose. So if the promise of win and you're safe is collapsing, you have to ask, safe compared to what? This is where we talk about the economy of Panem as a cage, not a marketplace. You're not just poor in your district, you're poor on purpose. At face value, the setup sounds efficient. Each district has its specialty: coal in 12, grain in 11, luxury goods in 1. The capital can point to this and say, see, everyone has a role. Division of labor. Order. But here's the real question. Why design it so no district can ever be self-sufficient? Why make it impossible for 4 to keep its own fish, or 7 to turn its lumber into finished products without permission? There is a lot to uncover here. The reason is dependency. If every district controls only one piece of the survival puzzle, then the capital controls the table the puzzle sits on. Trade doesn't happen freely. It happens through capital-approved channels, on capital-approved trains, with capital-approved prices. You mine, you harvest, you sow, and the value flows uphill to a city that doesn't grow its own food or dig its own fuel, but somehow never runs out of champagne. District 12 is the clearest case study. You stand on a slag heap of coal, freezing, starving. Your father dies in a mine explosion so the capital can keep its lights blazing through all-night parties. The trains haul out tons of coal, and what do you get? Black lung, tesserae, and a bakery that can't even afford to give burnt bread away without risking punishment. That part matters because it shows the relationship between extraction and deprivation isn't accidental, it's design. And when people try to step outside that design, that's where the fences and peacekeepers come in. You're in a mining district, so hunting is illegal. Crossing the electric fence is illegal. Trading outside the official market is illegal. In 11, taking an apple from trees you picked is a whipping offense. The message is brutal and simple. You don't own the land, the food, or even your own labor. The capital does. So why does Victor's Village hit so hard against that backdrop? Because in a place where grain is rationed and game is contraband, a single house with endless hot water and full cupboards isn't just comfort. It's a miracle. It's proof the scarcity is artificial. Snow is effectively saying, see, the system could feed you, it just chooses not to, unless you play the games and win. We're going to cover how that miracle becomes a weapon, because the capital doesn't stop at controlling what you eat. It also controls what you see, what you're told about other districts, and how you're supposed to feel about all of it. And that's where the cameras turn on. Fear as policy, peacekeepers, whips, and treaties, the cameras turn on. But here's the real question. What makes those cameras work as a weapon? It isn't just the game's arena, it's the constant reminder that the capital can hurt you anytime, anywhere, and call it law. This is where we talk about peacekeepers. At face value, they're just the police. White armor, uniforms, posted at the square, making sure no one steals bread or skips work. But the relationship between a district and its peacekeepers is not community protection. They're shipped in from other districts, loyal to the capital's paychecks and punishments, not to the people they patrol. That part matters because it means your local law enforcement doesn't actually live under the consequences of its own brutality. So why does every square in Panem double as a stage, because fear has to be seen to work. Public whippings, executions, the stocks in District 11, the firing squad in District 2's nut. These aren't just punishments, they're programming. When Gale is whipped in District 12 for poaching, the real audience isn't him. It's the crowd forced to watch, the children who now know exactly what happens if you step outside the capital's script. We're going to cover why that feels so normal to people in Panem. And the reason goes back to paperwork. Specifically, the Treaty of Treason. After the Dark Days, this document doesn't just redraw borders, it rewrites morality. It says the games are not a horror, they're justice. Every year, the reaping is framed as fulfilling a legal obligation, a sacred promise to never again rebel. Fear is baked into the origin story, so any resistance feels not only dangerous, but illegal and almost ungrateful. So you don't just fear the games, you fear the peacekeeper at the end of your street. You fear the man with the clipboard who can dock your rations. You fear that a stray word in the hob, a missed curfew, or a snare in the wrong part of the woods can escalate from a warning to a bullet. The capital doesn't need everyone hauled off to the cells. It just needs enough examples that everyone imagines themselves in the square. Here's the real question. If the stick is that brutal, why do people still chase the carrot? Because there is a softer version of fear running in parallel, the glittering kind. You're afraid not only of pain, but of losing what tiny privileges you have. Extra tesserae, a few hours of electricity, a job that keeps you indoors instead of in the mines. For a victor, it's your house in Victor's village, your access to medicine, your family's safety. So the capital doesn't have to threaten you only with whips. It can threaten you with subtraction. Step out of line, and you don't just risk blood, you risk slipping back into the dark. And in a world built on artificial scarcity, that's terrifying. The real trick, fear and privilege are always shown on camera together, and that's where the media comes in. The games are not the weapon. The broadcast is. The real trick, fear and privilege are always shown on camera together, and that's where the media comes in. Because the games aren't just a punishment, they're a program. Think about it. If you strip away the cameras, the drones, the glossy recap segments, what are the Hunger Games really? They're a state-sanctioned massacre in a field. Horrifying, yes, but contained. The broadcast is what turns that horror into a national ritual you can't escape. Every district is forced to watch the same shots, the same deaths, the same highlights. At face value, you're seeing who lives and who dies. But here's the real question. Why does the capital care so much about how you see it? This is where we talk about control at the frame-by-frame level. The capital decides which arena angles you get, when to cut away from a messy kill, when to linger on a tearful goodbye. They choose which tribute becomes a tragic hero, which one is edited into a brutal villain, which poor kid from a lower district is reduced to comic relief. The same death can be a triumph, a tragedy, or a punchline, depending on the soundtrack and Caesar's voiceover. That part matters because it doesn't just shape how the capital feels, it shapes how the districts feel about each other. And Caesar Flickerman is the perfect example of this soft weapon. He's not a soldier, he's a host. He jokes, he flatters. He leans in with that sympathetic face and asks the exact questions that steer you toward one emotion and away from another. You're not just watching a terrified girl from District 12, you're watching the star-crossed lover because he told you that's the story. You're not just seeing a career tribute, you're seeing a confident, charming champion who trained their whole life for this opportunity. So why does that matter for Victor's village? Because the promise of that house is also a storyline. We're going to cover the architecture and the politics, but first, notice how you never just hear that someone won. You see the victory tour. You see the train, the parades, the cheering crowds. You see the new home, the full pantry, the lights that never go out. The relationship between the arena and that front door is sold to every district through years of carefully edited footage. There is a lot to uncover here. Those broadcasts teach you that becoming a victor means safety, status, maybe even happiness. You watch them hug their families on the doorstep. You see the mayor shaking hands. You hear the anthem swell. You're not shown the nightmares, the drinking, the phone calls from the Capitol in the middle of the night. And here's the twist. The Capitol never says out loud, the real weapon isn't the arena. It's the story wrapped around it. As long as people are debating which tribute was robbed, which kiss was real, which victor deserved that house, they're not asking a different question. Why does this system exist at all? And once you start asking that, the camera becomes a lot more dangerous for the Capitol. Editing reality. How the Capitol cuts the story. If the weapon is the story, then we have to ask, whose cut are we watching? You and I get Katniss's version of the games. It feels raw, chaotic, unfiltered. But here's the real question. What are the people in District 4 or 11 or 2 actually seeing on their screens? In universe, the Capitol isn't airing a shaky POV vlog from a traumatized teenager. They're running a live, weaponized edit. This is where we talk about control through framing. Every arena moment we read as brutal or tragic can be sliced into something heroic, romantic, or necessary. The Capitol cuts between tributes, adds Caesar Flickerman's commentary, overlays triumphant music, censors anything too subversive. A starving kid hesitating before a kill? That becomes a noble internal struggle. A peacekeeper blunder that exposes Capitol weakness. That never makes it to air. And the edit doesn't just shape individual tributes. It builds entire district identities. There is a lot to uncover here. Districts 1 and 2 are sold as noble warriors, almost a professional class of tribute. At face value, they're disciplined, glamorous, born to volunteer. The reason that matters is simple. If you're from 1 or 2, you're trained to see the games as your arena, your right, your stage. Everyone else. Background. District 11, on the other hand, gets coded as volatile and rebellious. Harsh punishment, strict rules, quick tempers. So when the crowd in 11 salutes Katniss after Rue's death, and the peacekeepers crack down, the Capitol can spin it as those people again, not a universal human reaction to a murdered child. District 12 becomes the scrappy underdog, the coal-dusted longshot you can root for without ever questioning why they're starving in the first place. That part matters because it keeps districts from seeing each other as full, complex communities. You're not encouraged to think, we're all poor, we're all controlled. You're nudged to think, those are the killers, those are the troublemakers, those are the pitiable losers. Stereotypes become a security system. Sponsorship is where this narrative control turns into literal life or death. We're going to cover the economy around the games later, but notice how screen time and gifts are a feedback loop. Tributes who fit the Capitol's preferred storylines, the star-crossed lovers, the honorable careers, the tragic but photogenic underdog, get more coverage. More coverage means more sponsors. More sponsors mean medicine, food, weapons. The edit doesn't just tell you who to care about, it quietly decides who gets to survive long enough to matter. So what happens to moments that threaten that script? Think about Katniss decorating Rue's body with flowers. Think about the bread from District 11. Those are cross-district acts of solidarity, tiny rebellions against the idea that this is a clean, isolated competition. Does the Capitol show the full tenderness of that scene? Or do they cut away, shorten it, drown it in commentary about honoring a worthy opponent instead of a child murdered for ratings? And yet, Every broadcast has to preserve one crucial illusion. The games must always look fair enough that anyone can win. The edit hides how stacked the deck really is. Careers with years of training, districts with no access to weapons, sponsors funneled toward capital favorites. So the promise of manufactured hope survives. Someone from your district could still make it. You just have to play harder, behave better, fit the story. But what happens when a tribute refuses the role the capital writes for them, and the cameras can't quite cut around it? Victors as influencers. The long tail of control. So what happens when a tribute refuses the role the capital writes for them, and the cameras can't quite cut around it? You don't just disappear them, you turn them into a full-time project. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when the cannon fires. They just change platforms. The arena is temporary. The victory tour is the syndication deal. At face value, it's a celebration run. The new victor rides trains, attends feasts, thanks the capital for its generosity. But here's the real question. Why does every stop end with a speech that has to hit the same notes about honor, sacrifice, and unity? Because the victory tour is a traveling propaganda machine. You're marched through every district, including the ones whose children you just killed, and ordered to sell the story that this was necessary. That part matters because it forces the relationship between victor and district into something twisted. You're both a local hero and the capital's mouthpiece, standing on stages flanked by peacekeepers, under cameras that can edit anything except outright rebellion. There is a lot to uncover here. Victors are pressured to perform gratitude and loyalty on cue. Katniss and Peter get explicit warnings. Smile, hold hands, sell the romance, or Snow will make their families pay. You can see how tight the leash is when Katniss tries to honor Rue and the crowd responds with a salute. Instantly, the peacekeepers move in. The message is clear. Your trauma is content. Your anger is contraband. And then there's the part the movies mostly sidestep because it's even darker. In the books, Snow tells Katniss what happened after she defied the script with the berries. Capital elites demanded her, and when Snow refused, they turned on him. That's when you learn this isn't just about interviews and parades. Attractive victors are coerced into prostitution, passed around as party favors under the excuse of obligations to the capital. Win the games, lose your body. It's a horror show wrapped in couture. So where does Victor's Village fit into all this? This is where we talk about the golden leash. On paper, it's wealth, endless food, full electricity, a mansion on the edge of your district. In practice, that comfort is conditional. Your house, your stipend, your family's safety, they all depend on you mentoring new tributes, doing media spots, answering that direct line from the capital whenever they need a soundbite or a smile. You can't just walk away. You can't vanish into the seam or back into the fields. The village keeps you visible, isolated, and indebted. You're an influencer for the capital's brand, whether you want to be or not. A permanent reminder that the promise of hope runs straight through their hands. So if victors are the long tail of control, what happens when the capital suddenly turns on its own assets and throws them back into the arena? The nicest house in a starving town. Inequality on display. So when the capital turns on its own assets, where do they send the message from? Not a speech, a house. Specifically, the nicest house in a starving town. You walk up the road from the Seaman District 12 and the world just tilts. Down there, you have collapsing shacks with coal dust in the cracks, families crammed into one room, and a kitchen that's basically a fire, a pot, and hope. The power cuts out so often, it's a surprise when a bulb actually works. Water is a pump, if you're lucky, a bucket, if you're not. Then you crest the hill into Victor's Village. Paved street, neatly spaced mansions, Katniss's house has multiple bedrooms, a bathroom with hot water on demand, actual appliances, and a fireplace that burns for comfort instead of survival. The pantry is stocked. The lights stay on. At face value, it looks simple. Win the games, get the upgrade. But here's the real question. Why does the capital need you to see that contrast every single day? This is where we talk about visibility. The village isn't hidden behind capital walls. It's right there, in the district's line of sight. Kids from the seam can literally point at the windows and say, "That's where the victor lives." That part matters because it turns a house into a permanent advertisement. Not for safety, for the games themselves. Think about what happens when a district gets a new victor. The sirens, the celebrations, the special rations. District 12, which usually lives on stale bread and squirrel, suddenly has feasts, fresh meat, pastries. Food parcels go out. There are fireworks, music, a brief sense that the capital has remembered you exist. Your standard of living bumps up for a night or a week, and your brain quietly links abundance to the arena. The relationship is clear. 2 children die, and in return, you get sugar and a show. So what does that do to a district's social map? It carves a new hierarchy right through the middle. Victors and their families move uphill, literally and figuratively. They're exempt from the mines or the fields. People resent them for having more, idolize them for surviving, fear them for their capital connections. But they're always set apart. You don't just visit a victor's mansion, you approach it. And this is exactly the capital's goal. They don't want you asking why the seam is starving in the first place. They want you asking if maybe, just maybe, your kid could be the one who makes it out. There is a lot to uncover here. The capital doesn't sell revolution. It sells lottery tickets. Here's the emotional whiplash. The same event that steals 2 children from every district also brings food, fireworks, and a promise of escape. How do you hold a clean moral stance against something that on the surface fed your siblings last winter? So when that promise cracks, when even the mansion on the hill stops meaning safety, what happens to the whole illusion? Living in the village, comfort without freedom. So when that promise cracks, when even the mansion on the hill stops meaning safety, what does everyday life in that mansion actually feel like? You walk into District 12's Victor's Village, and the first thing that hits you isn't luxury, it's silence. 12 identical houses, most of them empty. Paint peeling, lawns going wild, windows dark. At face value, this was supposed to be a suburb pulled straight from a capital brochure. Wide streets, working electricity, hot water on demand. But the reality is closer to a ghost town built for a fantasy that never really showed up. There is a lot to uncover here, because on paper, the system works. A victor's basic needs are covered for life. You have food in the cupboards, heat in the winter, security patrols that don't harass you the way they do the seam. So why doesn't it feel safe? Why does Katniss keep her bow nearby anyway? Why does Haymitch barricade his door and drown himself in liquor instead of enjoying his fully stocked kitchen? This is where we talk about autonomy. The capital gives you a house, but it also installs a metaphorical bell on your front door. You can be summoned to the train for the victory tour, summoned to the capital for an interview, summoned to the square every reaping because mentoring is not optional. Every year, you watch 2 more children from your district march toward the arena, and you're expected to help make them marketable enough to maybe survive. The games don't end. They just change formats. Here's the real question. What does that do to your mind over 10, 20, 30 years? The relationship between reward and punishment gets scrambled. You survived, but only by killing. You're rich, but only because your district watches you on TV every year standing beside new tributes, who probably won't come home. That part matters because it turns the village into a built-in guilt machine. We see it in Haymitch, the cluttered, decaying house, the bottles everywhere, the way he sleeps with a knife in his hand. That's not laziness, that's PTSD and survivor's guilt with a liquor budget. Finnick is the capital's prettier version of the same story. He has a gorgeous home in District 4's village, endless attention, a public talent as a charming celebrity. But under the charm is someone trafficked, blackmailed, and used. Comfort on the outside, total violation on the inside. And notice how victors are pushed away from their old lives. They live on a hill or in a gated row, just far enough from the district centre that daily contact drops off. You're too rich for your former neighbours, too traumatised to fit in, too monitored to speak freely. So why design it this way? Why not just let them disappear back into the crowd? Because the capital needs them visible, functional enough to smile on camera, but too broken and isolated to organise. A gilded cage makes you easier to watch. An empty street of half-used mansions sends a quiet message to every child walking past. Even winning looks lonely. The real twist is what happens when that loneliness turns into rage, and when multiple cages start comparing notes. When the tools backfire, sinner, mockingjays, and hijacked propaganda that loneliness is exactly where the capital thinks it has you. One cage per victor, one camera per cage. But here's the real question. What happens when someone decorates their cage in a way the capital didn't script? This is where we talk about Sinner. On paper, he's just a stylist, a fashion employee in the game's bureaucracy. At face value, his job is to turn tributes into walking billboards for their district industry. Coal, grain, lumber, luxury. But Sinner breaks the relationship between costume and compliance. He puts Katniss in that girl on fire dress that doesn't just sell coal, it sells danger. It says, "This district burns." Why does that part matter? Because it's still technically capital spectacle, right? The reason it's subversive is that Sinner uses the capital's own visual language, drama, glamour, excess, and twists it. By the time he reveals the Mockingjay dress in Catching Fire, he's not designing an outfit, he's designing a live broadcast of treason. The fabric burns away, the wedding gown turns into a black bird with wings spread, and every screen in Panem is forced to air a symbol Snow never approved. And that symbol? It comes from another capital failure. The Jabberjays were meant to be living surveillance devices, recording rebel conversations and flying them back to the capital. When the rebels fed them false information, the project collapsed. The birds were abandoned, bred with mockingbirds, and the Mockingjay was born. An accidental hybrid, a mistake. So why does a genetic error become the rebellion's logo? Because it's proof the capital's control isn't absolute. A tool of surveillance literally evolves into a bird that repeats songs, not orders. When Katniss wears that pin, she's carrying around a tiny history lesson. The capital tried to listen to everything, and it backfired. The cameras are supposed to work the same way. The games promise transparency. Every death on screen, every tear in HD. So the districts can't question the punishment. But the more they show, the more cracks slip through. Katniss saluting Rue after her death, covering her body in flowers, is meant to be humiliation footage. Instead, it becomes a broadcast of grief and respect. The three-finger salute spreads because the capital already wired every district to watch. Then there's the berries. On the surface, it's a desperate move to avoid killing Peter. But the real question is why the capital airs it at all. They have to. If they cut away at the climax, the games lose credibility. So they end up streaming a live hostage situation where a girl from District 12 forces the capital to choose between two victors or no victor. That's the moment hope stops being a controlled reward and starts being a weapon. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when the arena shuts down. The cameras follow you home, but now those same lenses are documenting courage, alliances between districts, victors refusing to play. And if one stylist and one tribute can hijack the signal this much, what happens when an entire district is built around doing exactly that? We're going to cover how District 13 turns propaganda into its primary weapon, and why their war of images starts to look uncomfortably familiar. Peter on TV, torture, brainwashing, and weaponized interviews. District 13 turns propaganda into a weapon. The Capitol's response? Turn a person into one. This is where we talk about Peter. At face value, Peter's capture at the end of Catching Fire looks simple. The Capitol grabbed a high-value victor during the arena rescue. But here's the real question. Why doesn't Snow just execute him on live TV as a warning? Why keep the boy with the bread alive when he's already a symbol of hope for the districts? The reason is brutal and efficient. Dead, Peter is a martyr. Alive, he can be rewritten. In Mockingjay, we find out Peter has been hijacked using tracker-jacker venom, not just tortured. Chemically edited. The Capitol takes the same hallucinogenic venom that once made tributes rip each other apart in the games and weaponizes it in a lab. They pair it with electric shocks, restraints, and carefully curated footage of Katniss until his memories of their relationship are flipped. Love becomes terror. Safety becomes threat. You remember the real or not real game later on. Hijacking is the opposite of that. It's the state saying, nothing you remember is real unless we approve it. So why televise him? Why parade this broken version of Peter across Panem on Caesar's stage? Because Snow understands something 13 is only starting to grasp. Media isn't just about what you see. It's about who you believe. Every time Peter appears on screen, pale, thinner, insisting Katniss will get everyone killed, the Capitol is running psychological warfare on multiple fronts. For Katniss, each interview is a precision-guided strike. She's forced to watch the person who once volunteered to protect her now beg her to stop fighting. That part matters because Snow doesn't just want to defeat the rebellion militarily, he wants to collapse its emotional center. If the Mockingjay doubts herself, the districts hesitate. For the audience, it's worse. You're not watching some random mouthpiece. You're watching a beloved victor, the baker's son from a starving district, slowly become a Capitol talking head. There is a lot to uncover here. The Capitol is cashing in on all the empathy it carefully built during the games, those interviews, that romance storyline, and flipping it. The more you cared about Peter before, the more it hurts to see him now, and the more his warnings land. Pattern interrupt. Remember when the Capitol sold you love as a ratings boost? Now it sells you that same love as proof the rebellion is dangerous. Here's the real question. What does this say about the system that produced Peter in the first place? Victor's village promised that if you survived the arena, you were done. House, food, safety, an escape from the games. But Peter's hijacking is the logical endpoint of that lie. Victors are never free. Their bodies, their trauma, even their memories can be repossessed and redeployed whenever the Capitol needs new propaganda. And if the Capitol can rewrite a victor's mind on camera, what does that mean for every edited broadcast, every replay of the arena, every official version of history? In the next section, we're going to cover how memory itself becomes contested territory, and why Panem's real war is over who gets to define what was ever real at all. District 13. New boss, same machinery. If the Capitol can rewrite a victor's mind, what happens when the rebels start editing too? District 13 is where we talk about that, because the supposed alternative to Snow's regime doesn't reject his machinery of control. it perfects it underground. At face value, District 13 is the miracle district, officially wiped out in the dark days, yet somehow still there, buried beneath the ash. The canon detail that matters is the secret non-aggression deal. 13 keeps its nuclear arsenal, the capital pretends it's dead, and both sides agree not to fire first. That part matters because it tells you 13 didn't just survive on courage, it survived on a very cold, very strategic relationship to power. So how do you run a hidden district for decades, with no open trade, no visible allies, and constant risk of discovery? You turn daily life into a military schedule. In 13, your entire existence is printed on your arm. Work shift, meal time, sleep block. No wandering, no spontaneity. No, I'm just going to the hob. Every calorie is rationed. Every resource logged. The reason is survival, sure. But here's the real question. When every minute is assigned, at what point does survival planning become social control? You see the same pattern with surveillance and punishment. Cameras in corridors, strict curfews, public shaming for breaking rules. When Katniss hunts in 12, she risks peacekeepers. When she breaks curfew in 13, she risks being thrown in solitary. Different ideology, same basic message. The authority watches you, and disobedience hurts. We're going to cover fear as policy in more depth later, but you can already feel how 13 uses a softer version of the game's logic. Step out of line, and the system will make an example of you. And then there's propaganda. 13 doesn't just fight the capital's media, it builds its own studio. They stage propose with Katniss as the Mockingjay, rewrite her into a symbol on command, and reshoot scenes when her grief isn't camera ready. Coin and Plutarch script the lines, pick the outfits, choose the ruins she stands in front of. The Capitol uses Caesar Flickerman. 13 uses Cressida. Same tool, new logo. You're watching dueling commercials for two different futures. So are 13's methods actually more humane, or just differently justified? Is the promise of eventual freedom enough to excuse turning people into assets on a schedule? There is a lot to uncover here because the series quietly suggests an uncomfortable question. Can any large-scale power structure avoid rationing, surveillance, and propaganda once it feels threatened? This is where we talk about why the story resists a simple good versus evil reading. Snow and Coin are not identical, but they're fluent in the same language of control. The real question isn't just who wins the war, it's who gets to hold the cameras, write the schedules, and decide when the temporary restrictions end. And when those tools outlive the war, what happens to the people who thought they were only props in someone else's revolution? Economy, fear, media, hope. The four pillars of Panem's control. So when we talk about who holds the cameras and writes the schedules, we're really talking about the architecture underneath all of that. Panem runs on four pillars: economy, fear, media, and manufactured hope. Pull back the curtain on any scene in the story, and you'll find some combination of those four doing the heavy lifting. Start with the economy. The districts aren't just themed for aesthetic reasons. They're engineered into single-use tools. District 12 mines, 11 farms, 1 and 2 polish the luxury goods and weapons the capital needs. Number District can feed, clothe, and arm itself at once. That's deliberate. Resources flow up the train tracks to the capital, not sideways between neighbors. Victor's village is the exception that proves the rule. A tiny pocket of abundance dropped into scarcity, just close enough for every starving kid to see the promise, but not close enough to share it. Then you layer fear on top of that hunger. Peacekeepers, public whippings, executions in the square, and over it all the legal stamp of the Treaty of Treason. At face value, it's justice for the dark days. In practice, It's a permanent permission slip for state violence. The games turn that policy into ritual. Once a year, every district watches its own children die on schedule. You don't have to raid every home when you've convinced people the law itself is a loaded gun. Now, add media. This is where we're going to cover the capital's favorite trick, turning punishment into programming. The games aren't just filmed, they're edited, scored, and narrated. Caesar Flickerman jokes. The cameras linger on certain faces. Sponsors are nudged towards particular tributes. Victors are branded and kept on screen for years as mentors, talk show regulars, and walking reminders that the games are still the center of the world. The story never ends. It just gets a new season. But here's the real question. Why doesn't the whole thing collapse under its own cruelty? That's where manufactured hope comes in. Victor's Village, sponsorship gifts drifting down on parachutes, victory tours with overflowing buffets. These are the maybes that keep the machine running. Maybe your district will win. Maybe your name will never be drawn. Maybe, if you play by the rules, the capital will notice you in a good way. That part matters because it reframes survival as cooperation, not resistance. Once you see the relationship between these pillars, the system snaps into focus. Scarcity makes you desperate. Fear makes you careful. Media tells you what's normal. Hope tells you it might work out if you don't rock the boat. Remove economic control and districts could trade directly, blunting both hunger and fear. Remove fear and the games lose their bite, becoming ridiculous instead of terrifying. Cut off media and the capital can't coordinate the narrative. Take away manufactured hope, as the quarterquell twist secretly does, and suddenly, the cost of obedience feels pointless. And when rebels start hitting all four at once, sabotaging supply lines, hijacking broadcasts, defying peacekeepers on camera, and offering a different kind of hope under the Mockingjay, that's when an empire designed to look inevitable starts to look very, very fragile. Book versus movie, how adaptation sharpens the message. And this is where the adaptation gets dangerous. When you picture Victor's Village, what do you see? Probably those clean, identical houses in the film. White trim, perfect lawns, empty streets. At face value, it looks like a quiet suburb dropped on the edge of a coal pit. But here's the real question. Why does the movie's version feel so neat when the books make it feel so haunted? On the page, Victor's Village is roomy, spaced out, almost echoing. Katniss walks through fully powered kitchens, hot water closets of capital clothes, and it all lands as wrong. The relationship between space and silence is the horror. You sit in her head while she counts empty houses, watches Haymitch's place rot under bottles, hides in an unused home when the fence goes live. The comfort keeps turning into a threat, because you're trapped in her interior monologue. The films flip that. Visually, the village becomes a sterile reward zone. Snow on the roofs, Peter dropping by with bread, a few wide shots, and we're out. We're going to cover trauma, sure, but mostly through scars you can see. Peter's limp, Katniss's nightmares, the awkward Victor interviews. There is a lot to uncover here, because the camera naturally prioritizes what can be shown. Architecture, costumes, spectacle. That same shift hits the games even harder. The books give you the boredom between sponsor gifts, the hunger, the stink of the arena water, all filtered through Katniss's running commentary. You feel how the rules change in real time, and how every cannon shot rewires her brain. The spectacle is there, but it's mediated through fear and confusion. On film, the arena is a production. Sweeping crane shots, immaculate fireballs, that glass control room where Seneca and his team dial in mutts and weather. It's brilliant cinema and very intentional propaganda inside the story. but it also risks doing what the capital is doing, making the games thrilling to watch. You're horrified, yes, but you're also impressed by the engineering. That part matters because the adaptation almost demonstrates in real time how authoritarian media can critique violence and glamorize it in the same frame. Notice who gets more screen time: Snow and Seneca. In the first film especially, we keep cutting away from Katniss to Snow's rose garden and Seneca's command center. This is where we talk about political engineering. The book hints that the arena is a manufactured ecosystem. The movie shows you the sliders, the holograms, the head game maker walking into a room of Nightlock as punishment. The capital's control stops being abstract law and turns into a workplace drama. So which version tells the truth about control? The answer is that they split the job. The books tell you how it feels from the inside, the constant dread in Victor's village, the sense that the games never end. The films tell you how it looks from the outside, the spotless suburbs, the gleaming arenas, the executives pulling weather out of thin air. And once you put those together, you get a fuller system, a prison that feels inescapable from within and looks enviable from afar. The next step is asking, what happens when victors start using both sides, interiority and spectacle, against the capital? Designing every district's victor's village, so when you zoom out from the capital's spotless suburbs and those weaponized arenas, you hit this strange middle ground. Victor's village. It's not the capital, but it's not the district either. And here's the real question. If this thing is supposed to sell hope, why does it always feel a little haunted? At face value, every village is the same promise in concrete form. Win the games, escape the reaping, move into luxury. No more mines, no more fields, no more 12-hour shifts. But if the capital is this obsessed with aesthetics, do we really think they just copy-pasted 12 identical cul-de-sacs across Panem? Or is there a quieter strategy going on in how each district's victors are housed? This is where we talk about customization as control. The core template stays fixed: separation from the main town, guaranteed electricity, capital-approved architecture, peacekeepers on standby. That part matters because it keeps the relationship between victor and district consistent. You're elevated, but you're also surveilled. Still, there is a lot to uncover here when you start imagining how Snow's planners would tune each village to its industry, its culture, and its specific insecurities. Take District 4. You can almost see the capital pitch deck, ocean views, big glass windows, balconies facing the water, nautical motifs everywhere, carved waves in the banisters, seashell mosaics in the floors, maybe even a private dock. Fresh seafood delivered daily, while the fishing families in town cram into salt-stained shacks and go out in dangerous storms. Why design it this way? So every kid gutting fish can literally see the upgraded version of their own life and think, if I win, I get that. The village becomes a permanent commercial for volunteering. Now jump to District 3, different industry, different fantasy. Here, the village would glow, constant electricity in a district that knows exactly how scarce power really is. Houses with smart locks, walls lined with screens, maybe even small personal labs where victors can tinker with capital-approved tech. You're not just rich, you're local tech royalty. But of course, your equipment is monitored, your communications tracked, your inventions licensed upward. The message? The capital can make you the genius of your district as long as you never forget who owns the circuit. District 11 flips the tone again. Agriculture, history of unrest, brutal punishments. So imagine a victor's village wrapped in fences and watchtowers, the most heavily guarded of them all. Inside, lush gardens, fruit trees bowing with abundance, clean irrigation, shade. Everything the workers outside are starving for. And the victors know they're not allowed to share it freely. Every orange that doesn't cross the fence is a reminder. The capital could feed you. It chooses not to. Across all of these, the pattern stays the same. Tailored fantasies, same cage. The capital builds the one place in every district that proves its power to grant comfort and its power to withhold it. So what happens when a victor stops selling the dream and starts using that custom-built stage to broadcast something else? What if the capital removed Victor's village? So what happens if you strip that stage away? Imagine Panem with the same games, the same blood on the arena floor, but when a victor comes home, they just go back to their old house. Same cramped kitchen, same leaking roof, a small stipend quietly added to the ration book. No new mansion, no victor's village at the edge of town. At face value, that almost sounds less cruel, right? No forced separation from their district, no gleaming suburb they're obligated to haunt. But here's the real question. What does that do to the games as a system? Because remember, the capital doesn't care about individual comfort. It cares about stability. It cares about the relationship between fear and hope. Picture a reaping in this version of Panem. The escort pulls two names. Everyone knows the odds are terrible. Everyone knows that even if your tribute does the impossible and comes back a victor, the reward is a slightly less hungry version of the same life. Are you volunteering for that? Are you training your child for years for a chance at an extra sack of grain and a pat on the head from the capital? Without Victor's village, the games stop pretending to be a twisted opportunity and start reading as what they legally are under the Treaty of Treason. Punishment. A lottery of execution. There is a lot to uncover here because that part matters, because it changes how every district emotionally invests. Why cheer in the square if the winner won't change anything you can see? Why obsess over strategy if the end state is just survive and go back to the factory? This is where we talk about volunteering and the career districts. In our version of Panem, districts 1, 2, and 4 build entire subcultures around training for the arena because the promise is huge. Wealth, immunity from future reapings, a house your neighbors have to walk past every day. Take away the visible luxury, and what happens? You don't get proud parents pushing their children to become tributes. You don't get kids clamoring to step forward. You get silence. Maybe a few desperate volunteers, but no proud careers. And when there are no careers, the games feel less like a competition and more like a random slaughter. That's worse for fear, long term. Terror without any narrative burns out. People either go numb or snap. The capital needs you to believe there's a pattern you can game, a tiny chance you can grasp. Now imagine resentment in that world. No shiny houses to point at when someone asks, "Is this fair?" No living billboards of supposed generosity, just generations of children reaped, and the rare survivor fading back into the crowd. How fast do whispers turn into plans? How fast do districts start thinking the only winning move is to end the games entirely? So we're going to cover this bluntly. Victor's Village isn't optional flavor. It's infrastructure. It's what makes the game sustainable for 75 years. The mansion, the parade, the visible wealth. Those aren't rewards. They're the minimum amount of manufactured hope the capital has to invest to keep everyone participating. And once you see that, another question opens up. What happens when the capital itself starts breaking that promise? Is Panem more stable because of fear or hope? What happens when the capital itself starts breaking that promise? This is where we talk about the core engine under all of Panem. Is it actually held together by fear or by hope? On the surface, it feels obvious. You see peacekeepers dragging a man to the square in District 11, the public whippings in District 12, the ever-present guns. The message is simple. Step out of line, you bleed. At face value, the games are just the televised version of that same threat. The arena is a yearly reminder that the Treaty of Treason isn't history, it's policy. Every reaping says, remember the dark days, remember District 13, remember what happens when you challenge the capital. 13 isn't just gone, it's turned into a ghost story. Parents don't have to invent monsters, they just say 13 and point at the sky. So you get this architecture of fear, controlled scarcity, armed patrols, executions, the knowledge that the capital can bomb a district off the map and erase it from the official narrative. That part matters, because fear is fast. You don't have to persuade someone who thinks they might die tomorrow. You just have to keep them tired, hungry, and scared. But here's the real question. If fear is so effective, why bother with Victor's Village at all? Why bother with the promise of parades, sponsorships, and a mansion on the hill? Why not rule purely by terror? This is where the hope piece sneaks in. Every district has those rare stories of the kid who made it, the victor who never has to take Tesserae again, whose family suddenly has heat, whose name the capital cheers. We're going to cover the victor myth more in other sections, but notice the relationship here. Sponsorships tell you that if you smile right, if you play the narrative, someone in the capital might literally send you life from the sky. The village tells you that if you survive, you don't just live, you upgrade. Even the idea of making it big as a stylist, a servant, a peacekeeper transfer to the capital keeps that individual hope alive. So is Panem more stable because everyone is terrified, or because everyone thinks they might personally escape? The answer is neither. It's the ratio. Too much fear, and people stop believing survival is possible. Despair turns into rebellion. Too much hope, and the regime's monopoly on power collapses because people start asking why the capital gets everything, and they get scraps. Snow's genius is that he's always tuning that ratio. Katniss wears the Mockingjay dress, he tightens the fear. More peacekeepers, harsher punishments, electrified fences. But he also tries to sweeten the hope, the victor wedding, the tour, the performance of a happy ending. When that fails, the third quarter quell is a brutal reset. It says, your victory was never yours. Pattern interrupt for a second. Does any of this feel familiar? Where do we see systems that mix fear of loss with the hope of individual success to keep people in line? Maybe it's a job where you're scared of being fired, but you're also chasing that promotion. Maybe it's debt, or immigration status, or healthcare. The specifics change, but the structure, the relationship between fear and hope, stays eerily consistent. And once you see that balance in Panem, you can start to predict exactly when and why it finally tips over. Our world's Hunger Games, spectacle that keeps us still. Once you start seeing that tipping point, you can't help asking a harder question. In our world, what are the games? Not literally children in an arena, but what are the big shiny events that keep us watching, debating, arguing, while the real decisions happen off screen? Because if Panem is extreme, it's also familiar in a way that's a little uncomfortable. This is where we talk about spectacle. You turn on a reality show where someone from nothing becomes a star. You watch a celebrity redemption arc, a sports mega event, an election night special that treats politics as a horse race. At face value, it's entertainment, or civic engagement, or just background noise when you eat dinner. But here's the real question. What stories are those shows quietly selling you about why some people win and most people don't? In Panem, the capital needs exactly one victor per year from each district. One mansion, one victor's village, one carefully lit success story. That part matters because it reframes brutal inequality as proof that the system works. See? Someone from your district made it. So if you're still suffering, maybe you just didn't try hard enough. We do a softer version of that all the time. A billionaire who pulled themselves up. An athlete drafted out of poverty. A viral entrepreneur. Their stories are real, but the way they're framed can turn structural questions into personal morality tales. Why talk about policy, wages, housing, or healthcare when you can point to a handful of victors and say, look, the arena is fair. They made it. There is a lot to uncover here. In Panem, Victor's village is physically separated from the rest of the district. In our world, gated communities, VIP boxes, and exclusive schools create the same visual. A small protected class on the hill, a sea of workers in the valley. The distance isn't just about safety. It's about turning economic design into a natural landscape. It just is. And media helps lock that in. Notice how Capital broadcasts edit the games. They zoom in on rivalries, crushes, one-liners from Caesar Flickerman. The reason is simple. If you're focused on Katniss versus Clove, you're not asking why the Treaty of Treason exists, or who profits from the spectacle. Our own media can do the same thing when it turns systemic crises into individual failures or lone wolf triumphs. One welfare cheat instead of a broken safety net. One self-made victor instead of a rigged arena. We're going to cover how far that relationship between distraction and control can go, but it's important to be precise. The point isn't to say, we live in Panem, now roll credits. We don't have mutations in the subway or peacekeepers on every corner. What we do have are patterns, manufactured hope, managed fear. Stories that tell you the game is fair, even when the scoreboard says otherwise. So the real tension becomes this. If our world runs on softer games, what happens when someone refuses to play their assigned role on camera the way Katniss does? From Victor's village to revolution, how the illusion cracks, so what actually happens when someone refuses the script? When a tribute comes home, moves into Victor's village and doesn't play Grateful Winner on cue. This is where we talk about how the Capitol's favorite tools start misfiring. Katniss should have been easy to erase. One train derailment, one mining accident, and the games roll on. But her status as a victor puts her in a different category. She's valuable content. She's housing propaganda. Living in the village gives her just enough visibility, just enough protection, that Snow can't quietly disappear her without raising questions in every district that watched her outsmart the arena. At face value, Victor's village is insulation, distance from the seam, from the hob, from the unrest. But it also means every camera already knows where to point. When Katniss steps onto her porch with Peter, when she kisses him in the snow, or waves to the crowd, that footage is pre-packaged. The Capitol built the perfect stage for its love story and accidentally built the perfect launch pad for a symbol it can't control. Because here's the real question. When does a victor stop being a trophy and start being a threat? The answer hits with the quarter quell. The third quell's twist, reaping from existing victors, doesn't just change the rules of the games. It breaks the promise of the games. If even your champions can be thrown back in, then victory never meant safety. It never meant escape. It was always just a stay of execution. That part matters because everyone is watching. District kids who once dreamed of volunteering see the odds reset to zero. Capital citizens who treated victors as celebrities suddenly realize their favorites are disposable. You can almost feel the relationship between victor and audience snap. The value of becoming a victor collapses overnight. And remember, those victors are scattered in their own little luxury prisons, 1 or 2 per district, isolated in manicured cul-de-sacs. On paper, That prevents them from organizing. In practice, it concentrates trauma. Every village is a haunted neighborhood. Once the quell reveals that the system will never truly let them go, that shared damage becomes a network. Haymitch, Beatty, Johanna, Finnick, people the capital trained to perform now redirect that performance toward rebellion. We're going to cover media more in the next section, but you can already see the pivot. The same broadcast infrastructure that sold the Katniss-Peeta romance starts carrying glitches, a three-finger salute, a song in District 11, a dress that burns into a mockingjay. Then the Propo arrive, hijacked airwaves, Coin and Plutarch weaponizing edited footage of Katniss the way Snow once weaponized her kisses. Symbols flip. The mockingjay, born as an accidental capital surveillance tool, becomes the logo of everything they can't contain. Every time the Capitol censors a broadcast or cuts to static, it confirms the lie at the heart of Victor's village, that the economy, the fear, the media, even the promise of hope, were never about protection. They were about control. The Capitol doesn't lose power because it stops using those tools. It loses because it uses them so hard, so obviously, that the game stops feeling fair to anyone on the board. And once people stop believing the game is fair, the next question isn't whether they'll rebel, it's how soon and who they'll follow when the cameras turn back on. So, what was Victor's village, really? So when you zoom out from all four pillars, economy, fear, media, and hope, you end up back in the same quiet cul-de-sac, Victor's village. At face value, it's the happy ending. You win the games, you get a house, your family never worries about food again. But here's the real question. If this is a reward, why does it function so perfectly as a cage for the victor, a billboard for the district, and a power plant for the capital's entire control system at the same time? This is where we talk about design. Economically, Victor's village is an exception carved into scarcity. One row of full pantries in a district where Tesserae kids trade their names for grain. One street with constant electricity in a place where the lights go out. That part matters because it proves the capital could ease suffering, but chooses to concentrate comfort in a few symbolic houses instead. The message is simple. The resources exist. You just have to win the government's murder reality show to see them. Physically, it promises safety. No more reaping, peacekeepers at the edge of your perfect lawn. But that safety is enforced by fear. You don't mentor. Your district's kids suffer. You refuse the capital's requests. Your family becomes vulnerable again. The village puts the victor close enough to remember what hunger felt like, and far enough away that everyone can see they've been removed from the common struggle. Then there's the media spotlight. The village is basically a permanent film set. Trains arrive, cameras roll. Caesar Flickerman needs a backdrop when he asks how you're enjoying retirement. The capital can cut from starving crowds to gleaming porches in a single broadcast. And suddenly, the narrative isn't Panem is cruel. It's Panem rewards those who play by the rules. And under all of that, manufactured hope. Kids in District 4 see Finnick's house and think, maybe the games are a chance. Kids in 12 watch Katniss and Peeta's Victor's Village interviews and wonder if being chosen could be a ticket out. We're going to cover how that hope mutates into rebellion, but the core logic is already there. Divide and elevate a few, distract the many, and keep everyone competing for one golden seat, instead of questioning the arena itself. The cruel twist is that the promise never really lands. Katniss never gets peace. Peeta's freedom comes with hijacking and surveillance. Finnick's luxury hides years of exploitation. Johanna's house can't keep the capital from stripping away everyone she cares about. The village offers healing on paper and delivers a slow-motion continuation of the games. So what was Victor's village, really? The capital's most elegant prison, a dream-shaped cell that teaches an entire nation to want the wrong thing. Not solidarity, not shared safety, just a slightly bigger cage with better furniture as long as you're willing to bleed for it on camera. And once you see that, you have to ask, if the nicest place in Panem is a trap, what does that say about the future everyone else is told to hope for next? If you made it out of the arena, if the nicest place in Panem is a trap, then making it all the way here with your attention intact is a victory. You basically just survived a 100+ minute arena of economic charts, political theory, and Snow's interior decorating choices. So, congratulations. You're the victor of these games of attention span. But here's the real question. If you've made it this far, what are you seeing now that you didn't at face value when you first met Katniss walking through that empty village? Because once you recognize Victor's village as a dream-shaped cell, you start wondering which cell you'd want to walk through next. So let's turn this into a conversation, not a lecture. If you could explore any district's Victor's village in detail, which one are you picking and why? District 4's sea-washed mansions with nets drying on pristine balconies. District 3's tech suburb humming with stolen capital gadgets. District 11's houses surrounded by fields they no longer have to work, but still have to look at every day. There is a lot to uncover here about how each industry would quietly reshape the architecture of reward and punishment. I'm also really curious how you think the mid-tier districts fit into this whole system. We talk a lot about 1, 2, and 12, but what about somewhere like District 7 or 9, where you're not quite starving, not quite privileged, but still watching the games every year? Do those victors become local celebrities or awkward reminders that the promise of safety is only ever temporary? How do you think their relationship to the games shifts once they can literally see the good life on that hill and still hear the sirens and whippings from the square? And beyond Panem, what parallels are you noticing in the real world? Food as leverage, media as distraction, neighborhoods built to separate classes while pretending to reward ambition. This is where we talk about the uncomfortable stuff. Company towns, gated communities, propaganda channels that package fear as entertainment. If something in Panem is reminding you of a news headline, a policy, or even a reality show format, put that connection in the comments so we can map those patterns together. If this kind of long-form breakdown is your thing, and you want more deep dives into how fictional governments weaponize hope, you can stick around by hitting the usual buttons and joining the channel community. We're going to cover more Hunger Games world building, more political strategy, and more of the quiet details that the films only hint at. Coming up, I'm planning a full breakdown of District 13's government structure, how a rebel capital ends up mirroring the system it overthrew, and a character study of Snow as a political strategist, not just a villain with good tailoring. How does a man who believes in a little hope as policy design a nation around it? And what happens when that same strategy is turned against him? If you made it out of this arena, you're ready for the next one. One last question before you go back to the districts. So before you hop back on the train to your own district, there's one more arena we haven't talked about yet. Yours. Because after spending all this time in Panem's map of power, here's the real question. In your world, what looks like Victor's village? What rewards feel at face value like freedom, but quietly keep you right where the capital wants you? Is it the job that pays just enough you're scared to leave? The prestige school that owns your schedule and your debt? The social media feed that gives you a tiny hit of hope every time you scroll, even as it decides what stories you see and which ones disappear? That part matters, because once you can name your own version of a mansion on the hill, you can start asking why it was built that way. We're going to cover one last pattern to take with you. Not as a one-to-one allegory. Panem isn't a secret documentary, but as a lens. Economy, fear, media, hope. 4 corners of the arena you live in every day. You can watch for economy and who controls the bread, who sets wages, prices, rent, tuition. Where is there manufactured scarcity that keeps your district competing with the one next door instead of questioning the capital itself? You can watch for fear in which threats get amplified: crime, enemies, failure, being left behind. Whose power does that fear protect? Then there's media. This is where we talk about the broadcasts around you, from news alerts to reality shows to carefully edited apology videos. Who gets framed as a dangerous tribute and who gets the Caesar Flickerman treatment? Soft lighting, tragic backstory, redemption arc? When you see a story, ask who benefits from this version of events. And finally, hope. Not the real messy kind you build with other people, but the small shiny promises handed down from above. The promotion if you just endure a few more years. The giveaway if you just enter your information. The "we're all in this together" ad that somehow never mentions power or policy or who designed the odds in the first place. Once you start seeing that economy, fear, media, hope relationship, you'll notice it everywhere. In election coverage, in corporate PR, in school policies, even in the way fandoms are marketed back to us. If this breakdown gave you a new way to look at the Hunger Games, rewatch the movies or reread the books with this lens on. Share it with the friend who still argues about which district they'd be in. There is a lot to uncover here, and every time the fandom treats the series as serious political world building instead of just an aesthetic, we make Panem more useful. So as you step out of this video and back into your own district, carry that question with you. When someone tells you, "May the odds be ever in your favor," remember, in Panem, the odds were never random. They were designed. So who's designing yours?